Good morning, my name is Lainey Webster and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this fifth iteration of this ongoing collaboration between the Defence Science Technology Laboratory and King's College Business School. Particularly warm welcome to any of you that might be new, so you haven't attended one of these video conferences previously. And welcome back to those of you that might have attended one or more previously. We really hope that you find this engaging and stimulating as always. So we've got a really exciting pair of speakers today who will be discussing the highly topical issue of workplace skills. So the nature of work is progressively changing, and thus the type of skills that individuals require to acquire and be successful in the jobs that they want is also changing. In addition, those skills that individuals might have already acquired can often fade over time, and this raises another aspect of skills that individuals who are involved in both personnel and training areas need to be aware of. So both of our speakers are going to touch on these kind of issues, as well as others related to the areas of skills in their presentations. As with our other video conferences, the use of video and microphones is limited to the panel only, so myself and the two speakers. However, we will be taking your questions through the Q&A function. So you should find that on the button at the bottom of your screen. And please do feel free to use this throughout, so you don't necessarily have to wait until the end of presentations to ask your questions, as I will monitor that as we go through. So I'll just give you a bit of a brief introduction to us at Dstl and the idea behind these video conferences before I introduce you to the speakers. So we at the Defence Science Technology Laboratory, we're here to ensure that innovative science and technology can contribute to the defence and security of the UK. This series of video conferences, alongside the newsletters that might land in your inbox on a quarterly basis, are part of a project called POTRA, which stands for People, Opportunities, Threats and Radical Approaches. And this is a 4-year project which is actually coming towards its end, and it has a focus on identifying radical, game-changing opportunities and threats from across the human capability. There's been 2 key objectives to this project. One, to assess the opportunities and threats to the people component in order to understand the art of the possible, and 2, to develop radical and game-changing future people concepts and solutions. So why are we here? Why have we put on a series of video conferences and newsletters? So part of trying to understand the threats and opportunities to the people component of defence has led the project team to engage with a variety of individuals across government, academia and industry about research that's being conducted in relation to the future of work. And what we found is that many individuals have interest in very similar topics. So we wanted to find a way to bring together this expertise and research and highlight some of the influential work that's underway. Over time, this group of stakeholders grew into a community of interest, and we now sit in excess of 400 members that all of our emails and newsletters go out to. So we feel like this video conference is quite a good way to bring the community together, highlight some topics of interest and some research that is new and innovative. And really, with the community of interest, we want to bring together people from around the UK to discuss topics of mutual interest and share expertise in the people futures space. We want to enable network building, share research on selected topics, provide links to stakeholders and links to people that might be available to assist with your work. Our communication has been through the quarterly newsletters. Please do let us know if you don't currently receive those, or you don't currently receive the invite to this video conference but would like to. Our email address is potra@dstl.gov.uk. So we're acting as a hub at first, so that the community can contact each other and work together, hopefully. So finally, moving on to today, we have our very first guest speaker is Irena Grigoulis, who will lead off the proceedings with a discussion of communities of practice, as well as the importance of soft and social skills. Irena will then face questions from the audience. We then have our second guest speaker, Dr. Marie Cahalan, who will present on some work that's actually ongoing with the Dstl, looking at skill fade, and then again, answer questions from the audience. We'll then open it up to further discussion, further questions from the audience around the area of workplace skills. I'd really encourage you to contribute with any thoughts, work that you might be doing in the area, or anything else that you want to raise, as well as questions that you might have for the speakers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Irena Grigoulis, our first guest speaker. So Irena is a professor of work and skills at the University of Leeds. She's an associate fellow of SCOPE, so skills, knowledge and organisational performance at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on all areas of skill, but particularly the ways that organisations attempt to share employees and the implications of these for the employees themselves. Irena's presentation will start with a discussion of communities of practice in the fire and rescue services, together with ways that groups can learn from novices. It will then go on to consider the wider area of soft and social skills and the extent to which these are collective rather than individual. Irena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leonie, for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me. Really pleased to be here. And I'm going to talk about an awful lot of things today. Let me share my slides. But it's dangerous. It's dangerous to speculate about the future. You can pretty much guarantee that whatever you say is going to be wrong. I am still waiting for the 15-hour working week that Keynes promised in the letter to his grandchildren back in the 1930s. I don't think it's likely to happen in the short term. So rather than engage in speculation, which can be enormous fun, but is not necessarily particularly useful, what I want to do is provide you with a very simple theoretical frame and talk about what's going on now, and then think about how this could change in the future. And if you are crazily busy, need to go off and do your emails and the doorbell's ringing because there's an Amazon parcel, then I suggest the thing that you remember from this presentation is that frame. And the frame is simply that context is important. When we talk about skills, we very, very often forget that they occur in a context. We focus greatly on the individuals who exercise the skills, and they are enormously important, and I'm not here today to tell you they're not. But what I am saying is that the context those skills are developed in, the employers, the work groups, the various structures are also important, and they're the bit that's neglected. So they're the bit I am going to focus on today. So that's what I'm going to say. If you need to do your emails, go ahead, come back and ask me difficult questions afterwards. I'm going to do it in two ways, drawing on two very different studies. First of all, I'm going to draw on some empirical research in the fire and rescue service and think about small work groups, communities of practice, and again, thinking about a bit that's normally neglected, the way they learn from the novices. And then I'm going to crank up and think on the theoretical side, and particularly the way that soft skills are theorized. So, fire and rescue service first. If you're interested in this research, I have put a link to the article I'm talking about today in the chat. It is completely free to access. Please feel free to click on it. And it's also in the heading of this slide. Together with a couple of colleagues at Leeds, James Brooks and Hugh Cook, done some research in the fire and rescue service. And one of the lovely things about this research is It's longitudinal. That is, it carries on over time. To date, we have done 3 tranches of research, starting off with a very detailed 3 or 4 months in the field, doing 15 focus groups, 62 interviews, detailed diary studies with an outgoing Deputy Chief Fire Officer and an incoming new leader. And we went back a year later. We've now been back a year after that. Firefighters tend to work in small, stable work groups, so 4 to 10 members. And if you want a nice academic label for this, we call them communities of practice, because these are the groups that work together and learn together. Distinctively, in our first phase of work, there was a recession on, and that hit recruitment. Our first phase occurred in 2017, and the entire fire service that we were looking at had not recruited any novices whatsoever since 2009. So you've got an 8-year gap with no novices. When we went back for the second tranche of research, they'd started to recruit novices, and we were very interested in the differences between the first 2 tranches, as were they. So this is some findings that emerged from our research at the request of the people who were being researched. And again, what am I not saying? I am not saying that in work groups you do not learn from the experienced members. Of course you do. It's the normal and natural way that work groups operate. But in small groups, you've also got the opportunity to learn from the new members. And in the fire service, we found that this happened in both very active and passive ways. So the novice's passive contribution was very simply being there. Fire service trains regularly. Part of their work commitment is lots and lots of training to absolutely ensure that they are fire ready when the call comes. However, when everyone you are training with is very experienced, it's quite easy to neglect that. And we certainly found that when call-outs interrupted training, which regularly happens, and you'd got an experienced work group, the moment they were back in the fire station, they didn't pick the training up again. When novices were included in the group, the moment they get back to the fire station, they go back to the interrupted training, because everyone was collectively responsible for the novice's competence. One of the firefighters said to us, "My life depends on him," pointing at the novice, "being competent." Comes to a fire, they need to rely on their colleagues. So everyone had an interest in making sure novices were good at their jobs. It also made the experienced firefighters reflect on their own practice. None of them wanted to look idiots in front of the novices or in front of anyone else. Suddenly you've got people in the group who are going to ask you questions, who are going to say, "Why are we doing that? And how do we do that?" So in all 12 watch commanders told us they were regularly now going back and checking on their own practice if they knew they were going to be talking about something to the novices. And the final one is storytelling. When you look at communities of practice everywhere, you'll find that people learn by telling stories to one another, by talking about work and talking about what's going on, by problem solving through stories. And this isn't just spinning yarns. This is part of work. When you tell a story, you're acknowledging that your listeners are legitimate participants in the group. And you are inviting them to listen, to participate, to question you, to what that story is about. And firefighters got some pretty good stories. But when you have been in the same work group for 10 years, they've heard all your stories. And you've heard all their stories again and again and again. So when you try to tell your stories, they're probably shutting you down. When you have got novices in the group, suddenly you have people who have not only not heard your stories, but need to hear your stories. Speaking to the deputy commander, this was a key feature of firefighting learning and firefighting practice, because the number of actual fires is falling. So the way people learn needs to be from other people's experience and from other regions' experience, and you need to find ways of harnessing that. So novices, people who haven't heard your stories before, make the stories go better. But as well as that, novices had an active contribution to both practice and theory. They had had a 16-week training course. Just when we were doing the research, it had just been shifted up from 13 weeks before they arrived in the fire stations. So they've got lots of up-to-date knowledge. Now, all of this was feeding down to the fire stations regularly, but there really is no substitute for a person coming in and telling you. And those 16 weeks gave the novices a legitimate voice in fire station practice. Every single station we were at, when asked, have you learned anything from the novices, said, yes. And they would talk about more up-to-date health and safety, more up-to-date medical practice, and something called the Cleveland load, which was a different way of winding up a hose so you could unroll it far faster. Yeah. Novices also had previous work experience. Many of them had been car mechanics, carpenters, and of course, a key aspect of firefighters' work is cutting injured people, fatally injured people, often out of car wrecks. To have someone who had been a car mechanic, who knew an awful lot more about a car, to have someone who had been an engineer or a welder really helped, because they knew an awful lot about cars or about cutting. So really valuable knowledge coming from the novices. And because firefighters worked in small, stable groups, because they had time to talk to each other, and because novices and work groups would talk to each other, not only did the novices learn from the more experienced firefighters, the experienced firefighters learned from the novices. Okay, that's one example of a context working well. And it's a context working well using empirical data, using field work. Let's shift to theory now. And shifting to theory, I want to talk about soft skills. Soft skills are already enormously important in work. They are a vital part of getting work done. When you look at the list of skills that are most in demand, soft skills always feature at the top, and they usually dominate those lists. And one of the nice things about soft skills is, through them, individuals can genuinely make a difference. However, one of the real problems with a lot of the language of soft skills is that people seem to assume that just because individuals can make a difference, this means that only individuals make a difference. And a lot of the things that we now label soft skills, in previous times, we have called character, and we have also called workplace relations. And that matters. Labels matter. In this context, labels matter because by calling them skills, we suddenly individualize responsibility for them. And too often, employers take a step back. So what I'm going to say in the context of soft skills is, yes, individuals are important, and individuals have different capacities in terms of soft skills, but so are employers, and so are colleagues. Many soft skills are absolutely impossible to put into practice without a context. If you think about things like team working or communication or leadership, these are inherently reciprocal and relational. You cannot have team working without a team. So 2 areas of context which are important in soft skills, and one's the importance of the employer. Employers are absolutely active agents in this. Go back to the old industrial relations literature of the 1970s, and you see that when in workplaces you have shirking or go slows or absenteeism or large amounts of turnover or theft, it is considered an industrial relations problem. It is workers expressing discontent with the work that they do. And it's down to the personnel department to solve. Now people tend to say workers are deficient in their soft skills. A few years ago, some American academics, Philip Moss and Chris Tilley, did some research across the United States. And in this, they included 2 warehouses in downtown Los Angeles. And of course, where do you put your warehouses? You put them in not very desirable residential neighborhoods. These 2 warehouses were a couple of blocks from each other, drawing from the same labor market. They spoke to the employer at one warehouse, who complained that they had massively high turnover, workers were totally dishonest, there were large levels of workplace theft, it was really difficult to hire, it was a dreadful labour market to tap into. They spoke to the employer at the second warehouse, who said, got a very stable workforce, very low turnover, very low levels of workplace theft. These are really good people. And the second warehouse paid a few dollars per hour more than the first. Gordon Lafer, looking at that study, produces a lovely quote, which is, traits such as discipline, loyalty, and punctuality are not skills that one either possesses or lacks. They are measures of commitment that one chooses to give or withhold based on the conditions of work offered. This is a relationship, and a relationship depends on both parties, not just one. So be wary of assuming that soft skills are the responsibility only of the worker. Second area where I put soft skills into context is the importance of colleagues. Now, the existing literature on soft skills, again, focuses on customer service. Really important area, customer service. I've written on customer service. There is nothing wrong with studying customer service, but it's an artificial interaction. It's quite often scripted. Certainly, the employee is required for their job to say certain things, often in a particular way. When you look at relationships with colleagues, those are very different. They're not scripted, they're not one-offs, they're not virtual relationships. These are sustained over time through multiple interactions. And so it actually matters how you treat your colleagues. This is where I worry about colleagues working in economics who tend to assume things like you have one interaction and extrapolate from that. Actually, most people at work will have an awful lot more than one interaction and will extrapolate from all of those. Some years ago in Harvard Business Review, two academics called Cascario and Lobo published an article in which, amazingly, given a choice between speaking to someone who was considered a competent jerk, so good at their job but really jolly unpleasant, or a lovable fool, really nice but not necessarily good at their job, for advice, most people pick the lovable fool. It's quite surprising. You'd expect them to go for the competent jerk. They go for the person who's nice, but not necessarily accurate. And that's slightly worrying. Let me wrap up and let me talk about perhaps future skills. Context is going to remain hugely important. And I think on the soft skills side, that's probably an area where the armed forces are getting it right. And a lot of the rest of the labour market is getting it wrong. We're looking at labour markets that are increasingly fragmenting, where relationships are very short term and where workers are expected to be both dependable and disposable. And it's quite hard to give skills such as loyalty when you know you are considered disposable. So looking at work groups, looking at organizations, looking at how people learn and who they learn from is going to be incredibly important in the future to sustain, maintain, and develop skills. Because, and I'll conclude with a quote at the bottom, work is socially created and sustained. So thank you very much for listening, and I pass over to Leonie to chair for questions.
Thank you, Irina. That was really, really interesting. I will encourage you to ask any questions that you have for Irina. I will fire off kind of while we're waiting for people to type in their questions. Again, just a reminder, please use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you might have. Just a first one from me, I guess, given the importance of soft skills in relation to other people, to what extent do you think COVID has had an impact on people's soft skills? And indeed, like, if so, what do we do about that impact?
Yeah, that's very good, very topical question. It varies greatly. I'm going to say context again, from context to context. With the same two colleagues we've done the fire service work with, James Brooks and Hugh Cook, we were doing some work in a call centre, and we happened to be 6 months into this when the pandemic started, and everyone was sent home to work from home. We were doing video diaries with them, so, oh, can we carry on? Yeah. And for the experienced workers, it was hugely positive, and it was great because call centres tend to be pretty restrictive environments. And we had people go, well, for the first time, I can watch Netflix between calls, and look, this is where I live, and this is where I work. And it was great. The company was very, very good at organising online socials and keeping in touch, sort of making sure that people had someone to talk to. The people it was spectacularly bad for were the novices who didn't have any contacts in the company. And so all the questions you would ask of the person on the next desk, they had no one on the next desk. And the Zoom interactions were not a substitute for that. They were great for the people who already had face-to-face relationships and then had to move virtual. They were rotten for the people who didn't already have face-to-face relationships and couldn't bump into anyone in the corridor. The other group that this pushing out and working from home was bad for, and they often coincided with the novices, were the younger people because of their home situations. They tended to have a bedroom in a shared house, which meant that sleep and work and everything else were now in one room, which was really constraining. So whereas the soft skills of these experienced workers who've got more than one room flourished, the ones who were trapped in their bedroom, who didn't have anyone to contact, they didn't. You started seeing pretty high turnover among them.
Thank you. It's very similar to Nicholas Holloman asks a question: what do you think would be the outcome of more virtual working and blended meetings on both soft skills, needs and development? So sort of similar question, but I guess, is there a point, like, can we continue to develop our soft skills if we're only having, blended meetings or virtual working environments? Or is there a point at which we do need to come back into the office to develop those skills?
Yes, I think you can. Because an awful lot of team working, communication, if we don't already know, we are going to have to learn to communicate through various video platforms. Yeah. I think that bit is here to stay. Hopefully, if the pandemic is battered down as part of seeing people face to face, but it could be a pretty major feature of most work. So we as individuals and we as employers are going to have to come to terms with finding whatever useful balance keeps people working in teams and keeps people connected and sane.
Thank you. So I've got another question from Phil Byram. He says, Irina, the fire service seem to have a high focus on professionalism and doing the right thing in the right way according to their training, rather than the military idea of fighting for your mates. Do you think the military has missed a trick and that our motivation may be more about professional pride, like that of the fire service?
That's a very interesting question. Yes. When we looked at them in detail, they did actually bend rules on the ground. The top management were absolutely, you will follow these rules as they are in the handbook. When you looked at the way firefighters worked on the ground, they were far more what I would call thinking professionals. In other words, they would follow the guidance the vast majority of the time. If they thought the guidance was daft, they would not follow the guidance. One example of that is the fire service was very keen that fire trucks only use fire engines. I'm being very American there. Fire engines only use a particular sat-nav. This particular sat-nav was not very good and didn't work well, and fire officers are not supposed to have their phones with them on duty. And what happened on call-outs when the official sat-nav wasn't working very well was everyone was on their phones going, no, we know where it is, it's there. And they would also film themselves at work. While we were doing the first round of field work, there was a huge amount of flooding. We were told at the time it was a once in 100-year level of flooding. And of course, a few years since then have shown we're going to get those fairly often. And the existing firefighters had been trained to deal with it, but had no direct experience of dealing with it, and videoed various things that they were doing through the phones that they didn't have with them at the time because they weren't allowed to have them. And these videos were actually used by senior management in training afterwards, going, look, this is what happens in practice. So yeah, I do like the idea of fighting for your mates, but I think, I suspect that the army also may in practice do an awful lot of the thinking professionals, of people who on the ground will do the thing that is needed and useful and helps, but isn't actually in the rule book. Personally, I have an awful lot of sympathy for that.
I'll just take one more question before we move on to Marie's presentation. I think there's a good number of questions coming in, so I'll come back to them for the further discussion at the end of proceedings. So a question from Joanna Harvey: do you think that soft skills are going to continue to be as important in an increasingly technological work environment?
Yes, I do, because at the moment, there is a limit to what technology can do. We are a service sector dominated economy. Over the last 20 years, if you look at UK labour market stats, the proportion of workers working in the service sector has varied between 79 and 83%. That's reasonably typical for a developed country. In an awful lot of those jobs, face-to-face interaction is a key part of the work. If you have a 5-year-old child attending school and you cannot pick them up at 3:30 at school drop-off time, you cannot send a little robot yet to go and pick them up. It's a person. And it may be someone you employ, or it may be a friend, but it's going to be a person. There's still very many jobs that we do not know how to automate, or automation is going to be one element of that. Look at security work. You may automate large parts of it. You may have cameras and touchpads and things like that. But somewhere at the end of the line, you need a human being to make a decision on what to do. So soft skills are going to be important. When you look at pay rates for soft skills, the highest pay is not for soft skills alone, it's for soft skills in combination with high levels of technical skill. If you know how to redesign and install a computer system, you also need to speak to the people who are working with it, speak to the senior management, run your team. You need a combination of those skills, and that's when they work best. And what we need to be looking at is how to develop both soft and technical skills in conjunction with one another.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Thanks, Irene. So finally, we'll move on to Marie's presentation now. So my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marie Cahalan. Marie is head of Applied Psychology Group and a senior lecturer in Applied Cognitive Psychology at Cranfield University. Marie's research includes examining the psychological mechanisms underpinning skills retention. Recent research has considered the planning, conduct, and analysis of future skills-based research, with a focus particularly on complex cognitive skills. Marie's talk will consider how new skills retention models must acknowledge that future tasks undertaken by defence and security personnel are likely to be far more cognitively complex. Marie, over to you. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Marie.
Hit it here. Right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So it's my first POTRA conference. What I'm going to do, you may have noticed I dropped out, my internet connection rather dropped out about 3 times during the start. of Irina's talk, which was quite annoying. So what I'm going to do is turn my camera feed off to preserve bandwidth. It's only ever happened once, but I've been nervous ever since. If that's okay, I'll do that now, and then I'm going to start sharing my slides. So here we go. We should be the slides that we want. And then share. And then if you could just confirm that you can see the slides okay.
I can indeed, thanks, Marie.
All right, that's absolutely perfect. And then I should be able to toggle through. Okay, so I'm going to give a talk around some research that, as Leonie has explained, is ongoing, which is looking at skill fade analysis for future skills. And the work is funded through the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory through the Human and Social Sciences Research Capability. And there we go. So first of all, let's consider the defence need around understanding skill fade and its measurement. Well, first of all, quick look at terminology. Skill fade and skill decay are often used interchangeably within the literature and in wider contexts. However, it might be argued that this takes a slightly negative perspective. And also, what about the role of knowledge, attitudes and other attributes within retention alongside skills? So competence, as a different term, refers in general to the ability to do something well, and therefore competence retention infers a more positive perspective and encompasses the knowledge and underpinning attitudes along with skills that must be acquired and maintained by individuals to effectively perform tasks to a predefined standard of proficiency. So here, obviously, the focus is on individual skills and knowledge retention. Understanding competence retention is important to defence because we know that knowledge and skills are retained at different rates over time, as is indicated by the retention curves on this slide. And therefore, defence needs evidence to inform various decisions that it makes around, for example, the prediction and management of knowledge and skills retention, the scheduling of refresher interventions, workforce planning, and the future design of human-in-the-loop systems. Now, models used to inform decisions around these aspects need to acknowledge that future tasks undertaken by defence and security personnel will be more cognitively demanding. And models exist to date that indicate knowledge and skills retention, but is their content valid for the future? So one such model is the competence retention analysis technique known as CRAT, which was developed for defence and security back in 2012 as a practical method to support training practitioners. So a method that would allow them to apply the science without having to run multiple experimental trials to understand how the different knowledge and skills that underpin their tasks would fade. And it indicates the percentage of a task force, which also means a unit, if you like, of personnel, that would remain competent up to 12 months after a period of non-practice or use of the skill, based on the types of knowledge and skills characteristic of their job or task. Now, CRAT is underpinned by the taxonomy of psychological knowledge and skill domains to the right of this slide, and it's in an abbreviated form. And these psychological domains represent categories that reflect the psychological processes known to underpin retention of task-related knowledge and skills. Now, there are differences between these psychological processes, and thus the domains, and consequently, they influence the extent to which skill performance of tasks is retained over time. Now, you'll notice that there are no attitudinal domains because it can be argued that attitudes work slightly differently to knowledge and skills in that they do not decay over time. Nevertheless, there is an important relationship between attitudes and skills retention, and hence the taxonomy's acknowledgement of this. Now, the model itself does not indicate individual knowledge and skills retention, and its approach is to identify the predominant domain that underpins task performance. The model was developed from applying the US Army's Research Institute's user decision aid model, the UDA, to a set of defence tasks, where each of these was representative of one of the 5 psychological domains. The UDA comprises 10 questions that essentially rate the characteristics of tasks that are known to influence the burden placed on working memory. And that is memory for concepts, so explicit knowledge, and also for discrete stepped processes and procedures. And this essentially resulted in the 5 retention curves that you saw on the previous slide, which was subsequently organised into a traffic light system of low, moderate and high indicative retention levels with corresponding intervals, as seen in figure 3 here. Now, CRAT, which is a more complex model than I'm able to go through here, it's a 5-step process, but it essentially enables training practitioners to match task components to psychological domains and consider their frequency of application and identify an indicative retention level. Other moderators are considered by the model, such as the availability and use of job aids, which may influence the retention level. And the output of this of the CRAT, when it's applied, can be used to inform recommendations regarding decisions around, for example, refresher training intervals, and also appropriate acquisition and retention management strategies. But recent research conducted by myself and the wider team, which includes Tyrone Anderson from BA Systems, revised the CRAT taxonomy. And this was due to concerns that the original might not reflect the knowledge and skills considered important by defence today and in the future, given emerging roles. And it was extended to include implicit knowledge and complex cognitive skills. And this was on the basis of a synthesis of theoretical and empirical advancement. Now, briefly, these skills included recognising complex decision making, which involves an iteration of information processing cycles that involves situational assessment, analysis and evaluation that will continue until an optimal decision is reached. Importantly, this is distinguished from simple decision making, where options available during a simple decision making process tend to be binary, but it can involve other categories, such as when a decision tree is used, like templated diagnostics, for example. Adaptive cognition represents the ability to constantly monitor the discrepancies between the current and desired state and adapt behaviour to meet the demands of a new situation. And finally, the integrative domain represents where attentional control, which is a psychological meta skill in itself, is required to enable the integration of 2 or more coordinated skill domains. So where 2 or more of these skill domains have to become integrated in order to conduct a task. Now, the taxonomy, and I'm going to give a very high-level overview here, was incorporated into a systematic analysis of defence and security task cases, of which there were 5, with military SMEs. And it was applied at the subtask level of analysis. And this enabled us to capture the psychological domains that underpinned performance of the subtask elements. We could then take frequency counts for each psychological domain demonstrated, which would show the proportion of the domains involved in each task. Also, for each of these task cases, the UDA model was applied at the whole task level. Now, this model has weighted values associated with the selected responses to a set of 10 questions, which produce a total UDA score. And essentially, this is fed into a formula that generated a predictive set of retention curves out to 12 months. We also included questions that would address additional moderators of skills retention that aren't factored within the UDA that underpins the CRAT model I introduced. And these were questions around training and context. However, responses to these would only suggest how the retention rate predicted by the UDA may be improved, given a lack of longitudinal empirical data and weighted values for their combined effects. So let's have a look at a very high level summary of the findings, because what I'm not able to do is go through each of the task case studies, but the findings really show where we are in terms of now and in the future. So first of all, across all 5 task case studies, multiple psychological domains were found to underpin performance, and this suggests that they're going to underpin current and future tasks. And this reflected either a combination of skills or an integration of interdependent skills. So where SMEs selected the integrative domain from the taxonomy, this identified that 2 or more of the skills involved in the task were indeed integrated. And there was evidence of higher order complex cognitive skills underpinning all the tasks examined. Interestingly, one of the task case studies we looked at was an RAF firefighter role task, that of the incident commander having to respond to an incident. And this resulted in no decay curve when we applied the UDA model. So if we think about the psychological domains that underpin this task, it gives us an explanation for the lack of a retention curve. If we take a look at the pie chart, which displays the proportion of the underlying psychological skill domains involved in performance of this task as a whole, we see that 75% of the task involves higher order complex cognitive skills, whilst the remaining 25% draws on simple decision making, which is a simple cognitive skill relying on memory for discrete stepped processes. So rather than being determined by working memory capacity, the science indicates that retention of higher order complex cognitive skills is enhanced by the development of a mental model. In this case, for the RAF firefighter role, patterns of incidents and cognitive responses stored in what we call associative memory. And this shows that the UDA, and therefore CRAT, which was developed on the basis of the UDA, is not appropriate for application to complex cognitive tasks in its current state. The psychological domain matrix shows that this task is underpinned by the integrative domain. So that's the figure to the left. And it was identified because the task involves the integration of simple decision-making, complex decision-making, and adaptive cognition. The SMEs also perceived that the subtasks were underpinned not just by explicit knowledge, but also implicit knowledge. So an explanation for this is that the incident commanders make rapid intuitive decisions when they face complex situations based upon the patterns stored in their associative memory. And whilst at the time they might not be able to consciously articulate the knowledge they are using because it's implicit, research shows that when prompted after an incident, commanders can articulate their implicit knowledge. So what for CRAT as a model? Well, its approach is to identify the predominant domain that underpins tasks, and this prevents identification of where multiple domains underpin tasks or where skills are integrated. And in turn, this will prevent development and exploitation into the complex cognitive area. Also, CRAT and therefore the UDA as models are only really valid for simple cognitive skills, such as procedural and simple decision-making, psychomotor skills, and explicit knowledge, because they consider memory for discrete step processes and procedures, and the recall of explicit knowledge, as well as frequency of practice. And factors influencing complex cognitive skills are not incorporated within the models, and therefore appropriate training solutions cannot be identified. One of these factors is known as task complexity, and this involves 3 dimensions: component complexity, the number of conceptual components within a task; coordinative complexity, which is around the nature of the relationships between task component inputs and outputs, and dynamic complexity, where new task inputs and expected outputs require dynamic changes. And as task complexity increases across any combination of the 3 dimensions, this leads to greater demand being placed on cognitive resources. In conjunction with task complexity, the development of a mental model is important, which is a mental explanation of a task's conceptual components and their interrelationships between these, which reflect the complexity of the task. Also, the type of training is important. The literature to date suggests that the superiority of distributed practice over mass practice diminishes as task complexity increases. And whole task training, taking a mass practice approach, supports the development and extension of a task's mental model. Okay, so we know or have found that complex cognitive skills are important, and skills are often integrated from looking at our 5 task cases. And so as part of a methodological plan for the future collection of longitudinal experimental data, the team identified unmanned air system, so UAS mission planning, which is supported by a BAE Systems mission planning application known as SEPTA, which is a piece of software, as an example of a pseudo-military type integrated complex cognitive task that we could use to collect data. Now, it is integrated, complex and cognitive because of the requirement for psychological domain integration and greater cognitive demand involved in the application of high-level decisional thought processes. And these regard things such as involving intelligence, terrain, airspace, as well as knowledge of the unmanned air system's performance capability. This task forms an ecologically valid representation of the types of cognitive tasks in current and future military environments. So unmanned air systems, for a bit of context, are used for collecting intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance information, and they can be used for the delivery of airborne munitions. And the lack of a pilot requires a detailed mission plan to be developed and uploaded to the unmanned aerial system so that it can fly autonomously. As you can see in this screenshot, the SEPTA application provides a 2D view of the mission space. It also provides a 3D option with geographical features, locations, defence tactical data symbols that represent various targets on the map. Now, the important point here is that SEPTA, as an application to support development of the mission plan, represents a well-designed human-machine interface, which in itself acts as a job aid to mitigate procedural skills fade. Now, if this didn't occur, participants in any experiment would not be able to perform the high-level decisional thought processes to plan a mission because they wouldn't be able to use the interface. And so the important point really here is that SEPTA provides a vehicle to test the retention of the psychological domains that are integrated, and we will look at these very shortly. Now, going back to this idea of a mental model, we have a mental model of UAS mission planning. And the image here illustrates that basically how we think about this as a task. All the components require decisions and knowledge. The central circle in purple represents the overall integrated complex cognitive task, and the outer circles represent the interlinked conceptual components. And the links between the conceptual components will become more or less activated dependent upon mission goals. And new task inputs to the planner will require dynamic changes to the plan. And essentially, effective task performance requires coordination of these multiple interdependent components. Task performance is operationalized in this context as efficient and effective mission planning through the lens of safety. And this acts to promote task meaningfulness and induces what we would call more elaborative processing of the mental model itself. Now, let's now take a look at the psychological domains that are involved in this task. So here we have what's known as a task scalar for UAS mission planning, and it decomposes the task into subtask and task elements, which are the blues here. And it shows the mental model component and psychological domain mapped to each task element. Now, looking at this task scalar, it acts to demonstrate that this is an integrated complex cognitive task, because performance of the whole task is underpinned by the integrative skill domain, which, as we can see here, is mapped at the whole task level. And this is because attentional control of mental resources that are required for the integration of 3 coordinated skill domains. And for this task, these are procedural skills, simple and complex decision making, along with explicit knowledge. So explicit knowledge and the procedural elements are essential and fully integrated with simple and complex decision making to form a functioning and unified whole. Now, examples of a task element underpinned by explicit knowledge would be 111, describe UAS performance details. So these might be around maximum distance or set speeds. An example of one of the task elements that is mapped to the procedural domain is enter the mission waypoints. And these elements reflect the procedural skills required to use the interface in support of decision making during the planning process. So, of course, participants in any study would need to be taught how to navigate the sector interface that cover these procedural elements. And without a well-designed interface, they would not be able to demonstrate decision-making in terms of entering information into sector that they have decided is required for a safe, optimised and effective mission. So quickly then, an example of a task element requiring simple decision-making is select the optimum air vehicle height and standoff range. So here sector is used to follow decision tree steps where you're cued to make a decision, which requires an assessment of numerical data. And complex decision-making, an example of this domain is develop the optimum mission plan towards the bottom of the scalar in 139. And this involves situational assessment, analysis and evaluation, which would continue, of course, until the optimal decision is reached. So that's our task and the psychological domains and the rationale for why it's an integrated complex cognitive task. Now we move into, okay, if you run this, how do you then go about measuring not just task proficiency, but understanding the retention of these different psychological domains if you were to run an experiment that had an acquisition phase during training and then a series of retention intervals. So what we've developed, I didn't quite catch that. Oh God, that's Siri. Oh no, sorry, that's my phone, how annoying. So a novel approach to performance assessment was developed, and this involves 2 types of assessment. The first is a military type task proficiency assessment that uses a discrete negative scoring system, and the second is a psychological domain retention assessment that adopts continuous negative scoring. The approach is adapted from Villaldo et al.'s 2013 way of attempting to assess complex cognitive skill retention in what was a command and control task, where points are deducted based upon the errors made. So to walk through this very briefly, and it is my last slide, assessment 1 takes a discrete negative scoring approach, where task proficiency is assessed by the deduction of points from 0, because it's a negative scoring system, against 3 different types of error during whole task performance. And these are deducted to a maximum of -40, which would convert to 80%. So that is the minimum level of proficiency for a pass. And so the percentage performance score is calculated using a set range of 0 to -200 points, where participants start with a score of 0, which in the negative world represents 100%, and where minus 200 points represent 0 proficiency. To maintain ecological validity, these negative scores would then be converted to positive scores and corresponding percentages. Assessment 2, on the right-hand side of this diagram, is a modified version of the negative scoring system used in assessment 1, except in this case, points are continuously deducted below 0 against the 3 types of error with no cutoff. And so to measure retention of the integrative domain, the negative scoring system is applied to each individual task element that we saw in the scalar on the previous slide to produce a negative score value. And this value would represent the sum of the negative scores associated with the number of type 1, 2, and 3 errors for each task element. And because the required coordination of complex, simple, and decision-making and procedural skills represents the integrative domain, measurement of the retention of these skills domain would also utilise the continuous negative scoring system. Now, because the task elements and their score values are organised against the psychological domains using the scalar, we can then calculate the sum of negative score values for each of these domains specifically, so that we can separate them from the integration to then look at retention. You'll see here the red line, which is the separation of domain dependencies through domain isolation. So I've already explained that participants would have to be taught how to use the interface, and then once they know how to use it, it has a well-designed HMI to prevent skills fade in the procedural domain. And therefore, to get a pure measure of procedural skills retention, we would need a number of embedded task elements to assess the procedural skills domain, and also do this for explicit knowledge, because it would be very difficult to test at the whole task level. And so we would have to use a set of objective questions. Nevertheless, the work is still ongoing, and this was a very high overview now, but I can confirm that this is the end of me talking, and I'm hoping that the Q&A may help unpack some of the detail, because the assessment of complex cognitive skills it's difficult in the education domain, and so it is a key challenge that Defence has at the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Marie. That was incredibly engaging and very detailed in terms of the work that you've done and is ongoing in the lab. As before, I'll kind of give a little bit of time for people to type their questions into the Q&A, but I suppose I have one. It may be a fairly obvious question, really, but I wonder, you mentioned around skills fading under conditions of non-practice. Are there any circumstances where skills can fade even when they are being practiced?
Yes, there is. So one of the issues with the concept of decay in itself is that suggests that skills decay purely from a forgetting perspective. And of course, we know this isn't the case. You can have interference, particularly where individuals are expected to take more than one job role. So they're undertaking more than one task. And so one task can actually interfere with another task. So you have this idea of proactive and retroactive interference within the literature. So yes, you're right, it's wider than just the decay perspective.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it kind of seems counterintuitive to think that if you are using a skill, whether it would actually fade, but I guess, yeah, if you're using lots of other skills as well.
Yeah.
Just having a look if we've got any other questions from the floor. Just encourage any other questions that you might have to come in there. And in your work, have you found that cognitive skills seem to fade quicker than soft skills or technical skills? Or
okay, so that's a really interesting point. At the moment, what I present is the bare high-level bones of a methodological plan, which, because of COVID, the experiment is yet to run. Interestingly, in the literature, we could only come across one study that suggested that complex cognitive skills would be retained for a period of up to 6 months. The difficulty is that study didn't pin down the exact nature of the cognitive complex skill, but from the description, it was more around decision making, which is, fine. So we don't know. But I think the idea that procedural knowledge and explicit knowledge, procedural skills and explicit knowledge underpin performance of higher level cognition, simply because we are using more technology, and therefore it's those skills that will probably decay at much faster rate than the cognitive skill. So this idea of having great HMI design, because there's lots of work out there, almost takes the training burden away from constantly training to try and refresh procedural skills. You can actually design procedural skills fade out by using a well-designed HMI.
Okay, interesting. So I've got a question from Venetia Field, who asks, related to that question, can attitudes to safety decay over time?
That's great. So one of the points I think I made in the taxonomy is there weren't any attitudinal domains. And attitudes can result in behavioural shifts over time. And in the training context, the way defence goes about developing attitudes is by thinking about them in explicit context, so such as safety and culture and ethos. So they almost have a knowledge component to them. So it may be the knowledge of how the military system operates and its values and views, in order to help those become ingrained in personnel. So I would say that attitudes, as we know, can change, but it's more about a behavioural shift, and it necessarily wouldn't follow the curve pattern that other knowledge and skills do. So yeah, it is a complex area, and in the cyber domain as well.
Nicholas Holeman says, are there variations in the visual representations, e.g. colour choices or text versus numbers of mission plans that affect the skill retention over time?
Okay, so is that to do with how the information is presented within the sector interface?
I assume I'll wait for his response, but
because obviously there's a standardized set of tools. So the map overlay would look the same in the 2D view for everybody, depending on the mission itself. So I'm probably not understanding the question properly. But colouring is important, especially if you want to distinguish information. So you want to avoid, red and greens, etc., and make sure that anybody could use that tool, independent of individual differences.
Just give it a minute or so for any other questions directly for Marie. Nicholas says, could we design better visual representations to give better skill retention?
Yes, I think we can. So the screenshot I showed you doesn't really show you the power behind the sector mission planning tool, but it's had a large body of development behind it to take in all the human factors practice. And there's been a lot of end user testing with the RAF, because it's actually a Typhoon mission planning tool. But we are using it in the context of unmanned aerial system mission planning purely for the purpose of to run the experiment, because it works and it does the same thing. But yes, I think design can be, it's just we've got to get those principles earlier in the design phase rather than factoring in them later and trying to deal with any issues with HMI design via extra training, because that creates a burden, and obviously the more training you have, it comes at a cost.
May I ask a question, Marie?
Yes, please.
I'm interested in what jobs these people are doing normally, and does that affect the skill phase, intuitively, I would have thought that if you are doing work that is related to aspects of this, you will probably retain the rest much better. because
Yes.
it's linked to things you are familiar with. Whereas if you just do the training and go off for 12 months to do something completely different, again, intuitively, I would have thought you're going to retain
Yes.
precious little.
Yeah. So I think Defence is working to capture the knowledge and skills that individuals have attained by the various job roles that they have undertaken, so that they can be almost better matched to work roles, because we know that defence and security personnel will shift posts and roles. We also see this in the civil service as well. So if we can understand the overarching, not just job related, but the individual underpinning knowledge skills as well that they carry with them. I'm going to use the term skills passport here, but that wouldn't be lost. All that knowledge and experience could be taken into another context, but one in which it is related, which would also strengthen the body of skills within an organisation. So it's a really important point that you've made there, that link. So yes, the context is important. And of course, planning, you can do planning not just for US missions, but other forms of missions as well.
Another really interesting question from Colette Defoe, who says, Marie, did this body of work also consider skills fade / retention for skills required when trying to perform under pressure and high stress?
Wow, the experiment hasn't, or the plan, I should say, because it hasn't happened yet, hasn't factored in time pressure, but we know it's important. And that original model that was the basis of the CRAP model development, the UDA, so the two models are related, if you like, did factor in time pressure. And so that would be something that could be achieved as part of an experiment where you build in a time pressure component. We could also try and build in adaptive cognition by creating a change to one of the mission task requirements when it's unexpected, to see how they would perform. Of course, we'd have to factor how we would do that in a controlled experiment so that everything worked the same across the various conditions, so that we weren't introducing confounding variables. But yeah, time pressure is an important factor. And we know it influences explicit knowledge and procedural skills, and therefore it would be safe to assume it would likely influence complex cognition as well.
Okay.
But, yeah.
I'll now open it up to sort of wider discussion and questions from the audience. So please feel free to either just direct your question generally, and I can kind of put it to both presenters, or if you want to target it to one or other. Again, whilst we wait for people to type their questions, or again, anything you want to raise, issues, work you might be doing yourselves, we'd be really interested in that. But I'll just go back to some of the questions that we didn't have time for kind of after Raina's talk. So we've got a question here. So the concept of collective responsibility for performance through training is really interesting. Do you have any insights from your evidence in terms of what driver or factors promote this?
Yeah, really, really good question. I think the overwhelming driver is the task. You know, if a building is on fire, if someone is trapped in a mangled car, then your job in the fire and rescue service is to put the fire out, to get the person out, to rescue anyone there. And you cannot do that as an individual. You all need to be good at what you do, and you are all relying on each other. And it's simply accepting the realities that is a necessary part of the work. And you tend to find that the group itself will gently, usually, sometimes with an awful lot of rival banter, it will clamp down on things like grandstanding and superstars who do glorious individual things but put the team at risk as a result. So groups are pretty collectively good at keeping everyone in line.
Another good question. I really liked that quote about things like turning up on time not necessarily being skills, but being markers of commitment. So somebody asked, are there ways that you can increase the levels or measures of commitment, especially during COVID times? I know you said this is based on the conditions of work offered.
Yeah, and I'd reinforce that. John Purcell, who's a great academic, back in the 70s coined the term cumulation, by which he meant that employees judge employers based on the way employers behave, not on what they say, but on what they do. And most of us are pretty good at spotting the difference between what an employer says and what an employer does, and heavily weighting what an employer does. It's very crudely back to the good old Victorian do as you would be done by. If you treat your employees decently, they will spot that you are treating them decently. And it's in pandemic times, we have all heard terrible stories of employers who absolutely did not value health and safety, who forcibly told employees that didn't matter if they had COVID symptoms, they were going to come in and getting the job done. People remember things like that. It influences the way they act at work. It influences what they think about their employers. If you want a label for it, I call it the Gregulis "people are not daft" thesis.
Thank you. And this could be a question for either of you, really, that there are employers who assume with the pandemic that online transactions are sufficient for maintaining the necessary relations for business as usual and are planning to abolish the physical office space. What potential risks do these organisations face?
Oh. What would I say for that? Because it's really interesting. I mean, for me, it's all about culture. For people that are new to joining organisations, they don't get the corridor offside chats where they get to speak to somebody that might have only a little bit more experience than they do, or maybe, a well-tuned expert, which really helps them embed into a role and learn. And I'd argue that is, I'm not saying it's not impossible to achieve, but it'd be a lot more difficult just staring at a screen and trying to set up a Zoom meeting with somebody whose diary is very busy. So please, Irina, you probably have a lot more.
No, I absolutely agree. That's spot on. This is actually something that we know a lot about because it's been happening in the IT sector for many decades, and it is commonplace to outsource things like coding to countries where you've got very highly educated but very cheap workers. And then you have the problem of managing teams that are split over many sites in different countries with different languages, with very different experience. And it is tough. It is really tough. Jobs that are being nationally outsourced within Britain now that are becoming working from home jobs. And as an academic, I know I'm desperately privileged to have had a job in which I can mix working from home and going into the office for several decades. And that's been glorious. Working from home alone, there's a danger to the employees as well, that if you can outsource it to someone who works from home in York, you can outsource it to someone who works from home in India. It's not that much of a step. So the risks the organisations face is that it is quite simply much harder to manage a group you cannot physically see and never see face to face. An awful lot of employers are talking about moving towards a mixed economy of workers coming into offices a couple of days a week and working from home the rest of the week. And I think that's a very positive step. It'll involve employers biting the bullet and trusting the people who work for them an awful lot. But managed well, that could be really positive. Entire working from home is much, much harder to run successfully.
I think that seems like a good point to close. So I know I've personally found this discussion incredibly engaging and insightful. Clearly the field of workplace skills is very varied, and there's lots of different aspects to consider when looking at the future of skills. So not only does it feed into recruitment and how we get the best skills into organisations, but it's also relevant for training. So how do we make sure these skills don't fade over time, and that we're teaching people the right skills to be successful in their job roles? But clearly, ongoing research in this area is really essential to making sure that our future workforce is successful. So just a note in terms of any feedback for this video conference, as we normally do, we'll send out an email in due course and just ask your thoughts on the video conference. So please do feel free to send us back your thoughts on this one, as well as the series itself. Both speakers, I think, as I said, have kindly allowed us to share their presentation slides, so I'll also include those in the email for you. And we also hope that the video will be available for any of your colleagues that might have missed this event. So as I said, the POTRA project itself actually comes to a close in the end of the financial year, which is end of March. So it's likely that we'll hold 2 more video conferences, hopefully one towards the end of the year and then the final one in March. So we are planning that the final one will be a bit of a summary of all topics covered across these video conferences to date, and also signpost you to what might come next at Dstl in this people future space. But we would be really keen to hear your ideas of a final topic to cover in the video conference towards the end of the year, or any particular speakers that you might be keen to hear from. As always, again, please get in contact if you've got any wants or offers that you want us to share with the community of practice, and also if there are any other related events that you think might be interesting for this community of interest. And then finally, I just want to say a huge thanks to our guest speakers, to Irena and to Marie. I think your presentations were incredibly interesting, detailed and insightful, and nicely on different topics in this area. Big thank you for King's, as always, to continue to host this series of video conferences in collaboration with us, and Izzy in particular for all the work behind the scenes to make sure this goes ahead smoothly. And finally, thank you to all of you for engaging with us. Some great questions coming through, so thank you for that. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.